It started with a message short-polished and dangerously polite. A U.S. trade envoy requesting a confidential technical consultation with Burkina Faso's transitional government. No cameras, no press, no official agenda. But everyone in that room knew what it was really about. Gold, and the new global scramble for it. Washington had just shifted its mineral strategy, opening a channel for American companies to import gold without the old restrictions. A quiet signal, the kind insiders recognize instantly. Markets moved, mining firms repositioned, and somewhere inside the State Department, someone circled one name on the map: Burkina Faso, a country sitting on some of the richest gold veins in West Africa and governed by a leader who does not bend. The request came wrapped in diplomatic courtesy, but the subtext was sharp. Let's talk. We want in. No threats. Not yet. Just the weight of a superpower knocking on the door of a nation that has decided its gold will no longer be a silent tributary to someone else's wealth. Inside Ouagadougou, the reaction was immediate. Not panic, not excitement. Just a rising tension, the kind that appears when an empire suddenly becomes interested in what you protect. One thought echoed in every corridor. If they want the gold, what else will they demand? And that question was only the beginning. Before any secret meetings, before any whispered negotiations, one truth was already shaping the ground beneath both nations. The world is entering a mineral war, and gold has returned to the center of it. Not the jewelry gold, not the gold bars in vaults, but the strategic gold, the kind that stabilizes currencies, backs debt, anchors economic power, and signals confidence when global markets shake. When Washington lifted restrictions on key minerals, analysts tried to spin it as a trade adjustment. But the insiders knew better. It was a recalibration of power. Gold was being pulled back into geopolitics, and Africa, once dismissed as a passive supplier, became the new battlefield. Burkina Faso, long overshadowed by larger economies, suddenly appeared in the crosshairs. Not because its mines were bigger than South Africa's or richer than Ghana's, but because Burkina Faso had something far more dangerous, a leader who refuses to negotiate from his knees, a doctrine of resource sovereignty, and an unwillingness to trade gold for influence. In Washington, this combination triggered concern. Reports circulated inside think tanks Burkina was consolidating control over its mining sector. Foreign contracts were being reviewed. Middlemen were being pushed out. And the government had begun developing its own sovereign data system, one that could track every gram of gold leaving the ground. For American strategists, this was a problem, because without access to data, they had no leverage. Without leverage, they had no strategy. And without strategy, they had no guarantee of supply, not in a world where China and Russia were already expanding their reach over global metals. So pressure began quietly. Economic envoys requested meetings. Mining corporations sent investment proposals. Consultants talked about partnership and modernization, all wrapped in the language of cooperation. But in every one of these messages, one demand kept appearing in different forms, different tones, different disguises: access to data, to operations, to the flow of gold. Burkina Faso read these signals clearly, and Traoré understood exactly what they meant. Gold was no longer a commodity. It was the last frontier of sovereignty. This was no longer about mining. It was about who writes the rules and who lives under them. The first proposals looked innocent. A few pages, technical vocabulary, glossy promises, words like modernization, joint investment, operational partnership, the usual diplomatic perfume used to hide the smell of pressure. But the deeper Burkina's analysts read, the uglier the pattern became. Buried inside the documents were demands that had nothing to do with trade clauses requesting oversight access clauses, allowing foreign auditors to enter extraction zones, clauses granting temporary administrative authority over parts of the mining workflow whenever production stability was at risk. It was not cooperation. It was control wrapped in corporate language, and everyone in Ouagadougou saw it. One advisor described it perfectly. They want to manage the heartbeat of our gold. Behind closed doors, American mining executives were blunt. They talked less like investors and more like supervisors preparing to take charge. They wanted direct communication with mine managers, control over export scheduling, and real-time monitoring of extraction volumes down to the kilogram. Not because they doubted Burkina's production, but because data equals power. Whoever controls the numbers controls the negotiation. Meanwhile, subtle diplomatic waves began to appear. A Western financial institution delayed a loan approval to a Sahel infrastructure project. A policy think tank published a report warning that Burkina's resource nationalism could destabilize investment climates. A U.S. official made a comment about opaque gold practices in the Sahel. Nothing overt, nothing explosive, just pressure applied systematically. Inside Burkina Faso, the reaction was split. Some technocrats insisted that accepting even part of the deal could bring money and stability. Others, especially those close to Traoré, understood the larger game. If you give someone access to your gold data today, they will claim influence over your gold decisions tomorrow. And so, the government stayed silent, watching, listening, letting the proposals arrive, letting the pressure build, letting the world assume Burkina was still considering its options. But beneath that calm surface, a conclusion had already crystallized. The moment the U.S. shifted its mineral policy, Burkina was no longer negotiating with a company, it was negotiating with an empire that wanted a foothold in its most sacred resource. This was no longer a trade conversation. It was the prelude to confrontation. The shift came without warning. No public statement, no polite prelude, just an encrypted diplomatic ping delivered quietly through a channel reserved for matters too sensitive to appear in any archive. The message was simple. A U.S. envoy, representing both Washington and a major Texas-based mining conglomerate, wished to open a confidential commercial dialogue with Burkina Faso. Not a delegation, not a summit. A closed-door session, 3 sides only. The request alone revealed everything. When a superpower avoids protocol, it means the stakes are higher than the paperwork can safely hold. The meeting happened in a neutral building, no flags, no recording devices, no staff allowed inside except a single translator whose hands visibly trembled each time the Americans shifted tone. They began smoothly, friendly, predictable. The language of partnership rehearsed to perfection. They spoke about investment, significant investment. They spoke about modernization, world-class modernization. And they spoke about stability, long-term guaranteed stability. Then the real purpose surfaced. The mining conglomerate wanted full digital visibility into Burkina Faso's gold operations, not periodic audits, not annual reviews. They wanted live access, unfiltered, uninterrupted, integrated directly into their own monitoring systems. Every ounce of gold extracted, every movement from pit to refinery, every shipment from sealing to export, all in real time. They framed it as operational efficiency. They framed it as risk mitigation. They framed it as a technical requirement for partnership. But everyone in the room saw the truth instantly. Real-time data is not transparency. Real-time data is control. Because once a foreign power sees your numbers live, they no longer negotiate with uncertainty. They negotiate with leverage. Yet, the Americans were not finished. In a second folder, thin, understated, dangerously precise, a technical annex proposed integrating U.S. monitoring tools into Burkina Faso's newly built sovereign data grid. The same system designed explicitly to shield the country's strategic sectors from foreign influence. That was the moment the atmosphere shifted. The Burkina Faso delegation didn't speak, but the air around them hardened. The Americans continued their pitch unbothered. They presented charts, projections, 5-year strategies, each one a polished future in which Burkina Faso prospered, but only if it allowed a foreign presence inside the core of its gold architecture. Traoré's advisors exchanged a single glance. Not fear, recognition. Because this was not an investment offer. It was an entry point, a subtle, technical, beautifully disguised mechanism to place a hand on the country's most sacred asset. When the meeting ended, it ended politely. But everyone in that room walked out knowing one thing: Burkina Faso had just been asked to surrender visibility of its gold, and therefore the future built upon it. The Americans expected negotiation, a little resistance maybe, a request for better numbers, a softer clause, a middle path. What they didn't expect was the absence of reaction. Burkina Faso did not argue, did not debate, did not counterpropose. They simply watched. And that silence carried weight, the kind that unsettles negotiators accustomed to shaping the room. Behind closed doors, the Burkina Faso team launched a forensic review of the proposed contract. Not the financial parts, those were standard, even generous, but the hidden structural pieces written in sterile technical English. Every page confirmed their suspicion. The Americans weren't asking for oversight. They were asking for a digital foothold. One clause allowed the mining conglomerate to verify anomalies through remote system access. Another clause permitted temporary operational intervention if production discrepancies emerged. A third clause, buried under routine terminology, enabled data synchronization between the conglomerate's servers and Burkina Faso's mining output logs. To the untrained eye, these were safeguards. To anyone who understood geopolitics, they were leverage points. Because once a foreign actor can enter your system in emergencies, all they need to create is an emergency. Meanwhile, pressure began appearing in places that officially had nothing to do with gold. A European development loan was delayed pending review. A Western analyst claimed the Sahel was becoming a blind spot in global mineral transparency. Two international media outlets published coordinated pieces questioning the credibility of Burkina Faso's mining governance. None of these events were explosive, but together they formed a pattern, subtle, intentional, unmistakable. Inside the presidency, the mood sharpened. Some technocrats argued for compromise. A partial data-sharing arrangement, limited oversight, a gradual implementation. But those closest to Traoré understood the broader game. If Burkina Faso accepted foreign visibility into its gold production, it would never regain control. Not in 5 years, not in 50, because data is not neutral. Data shapes intervention, intervention shapes dependency, and dependency is the slow end of sovereignty. Then something unexpected happened. Mali reached out. Niger followed. Guinea joined the conversation quietly, cautiously, but unmistakably. The message was the same: if they pressure you today, they pressure us tomorrow. What emerged was not a formal pact, not yet, but the outline of a shared response, a regional instinct rising from decades of exploitation. Western strategists wanted access. Burkina Faso's allies wanted unity. And suddenly the gold negotiation was no longer bilateral. It was continental. This transformed everything. Because the Americans hadn't just provoked Traoré. They had unintentionally awakened a Sahelian alignment, the early pulse of what would later be recognized as the foundation of AES 2.0. And once that pulse began, there was no pushing it back into silence. The Americans stopped pretending. Up until this point, the pressure had been polite, wrapped in consulting language, diplomatic courtesy, and carefully measured statements. Then the tone changed. Not loudly, not dramatically, but unmistakably. A senior U.S. official sent a message through a restricted diplomatic channel. Cooperation requires transparency. Resistance creates instability. 7 words, calm, but designed to be felt. Soon after, a cascade of coordinated actions began. A Western development agency postponed an infrastructure project tied to the Sahel. A financial ratings firm issued a vague warning about resource nationalism. A major newspaper published an editorial arguing that irresponsible gold governance in the Sahel threatens global markets. Individually, none of these events meant much. Together they formed a chokehold. Inside Burkina Faso, senior officials gathered in a secured room beneath the presidency, not to panic, but to assess. What they saw was clear. The Americans were escalating the pressure campaign, and they were doing it systematically, economically, diplomatically, and through the media. Traoré listened as advisors broke down each move. The delayed loan, a signal. The media narrative, a framing device. The senator's comments in Washington, a warning shot. The mining conglomerate's sudden silence, a recalibration. They were tightening the perimeter step by step without crossing into open hostility. When the room finished presenting, a heavy stillness settled. Everyone waited for the moment. All leaders eventually face the moment they either bend or hold. Traoré folded his hands. He did not pace. He did not raise his voice. He did not indulge in speeches. He simply asked one question. If we give them access to our gold today, what will they ask for tomorrow? No one answered because everyone already knew. Access to data becomes access to decisions. Access to decisions becomes influence. Influence becomes dependency. Dependency becomes the end. And that was the line Burkina Faso would not cross. Traoré issued the first countermove. He ordered a nationwide audit of mining permits, tightened export controls, a freeze on new foreign access mining agreements, reinforcement of the sovereign data grid, the digital shield the Americans wanted to penetrate. It was a message without theatrics. Burkina Faso would not negotiate at the edge of a knife. Within hours, the reaction came. A Western economist warned that Burkina Faso risks isolation. A mineral lobby group urged Washington to protect strategic supply chains. A diplomatic cable described Traoré as uncooperative. But inside Ouagadougou, the mood had shifted. The Americans had made their move. Now it was Burkina Faso's turn to shape the next one. The escalation didn't announce itself. It slipped in quietly the way real power always does. A leaked memo appeared in diplomatic circles. Short, unattributed, dangerous. It stated that several Western partners are evaluating coordinated economic responses should Burkina Faso continue to restrict transparency in its gold sector. No dates, no agencies, no signatures, just intent. The kind of intent that doesn't need proof to be effective. When the memo reached Ouagadougou, the reaction was immediate. Not fear, but recognition. This was no longer pressure. This was alignment. Different institutions, different governments, different voices, all leaning in the same direction. Burkina Faso stood at the center of a slow, controlled tightening, the methodical pressure of a global architecture accustomed to obedience. Inside the presidency, the Security Council convened again. The question on the table was not technical. It was existential. Are we facing a negotiation or a coordinated containment? Evidence pointed to containment. Economic signals were turning hostile. Diplomatic language was sharpening. Think tanks were shaping narratives. Mining interests were calling their allies in Washington. The gold dispute was evolving into something larger, a test of whether an African state could refuse a Western demand without consequences. And then something shifted. Mali sent a discreet message, "We are watching. You are not alone." Niger followed. Pressure on one becomes pressure on all. Guinea added a quiet suggestion. Perhaps it is time to coordinate our gold exports. The responses were calm, measured, but their meaning was seismic. For the first time in years, the Sahel was not moving separately. It was aligning quietly, instinctively, without declarations or summits. Not an alliance, not yet, but the outline of a shared shield drawn by the simple understanding that sovereignty is meaningless if it cannot survive pressure. Western analysts noticed the shift instantly. A U.S. senator warned that regional consolidation in the Sahel could destabilize supply chains. A European official cautioned against mineral nationalism. A well-known economist claimed the Sahel was drifting toward a coordinated anti-Western posture. But none of them said the real fear aloud. If these countries coordinate their gold, they can influence prices. If they influence prices, they control leverage. And if they control leverage, the balance of power shifts. The Americans had come for oversight, but their pressure had triggered something they did not anticipate: the early pulse of what would later be recognized as AES 2.0, a strategic alignment built not on ideology, but on survival. Inside Ouagadougou, Traoré summarized the entire crisis in one sentence. If they want to follow our gold, let them follow our direction. A warning, a choice, a turning point. And the world felt the shift. When the confrontation is finally stripped down to its core, the surface story looks almost ordinary. A disagreement over transparency, a conflict between a resource-rich nation and a resource-hungry superpower, a negotiation that failed to align. But the surface is never where power lives. To understand what truly happened, you have to examine what the Americans actually demanded and what Traoré ultimately refused. It wasn't physical gold, it wasn't ownership of a mine, it wasn't even a share of production. It was real-time data, live metrics, unfiltered extraction numbers, full visibility into a nation's mineral heartbeat. Because in the modern world, data is not information. Data is prediction. Prediction is leverage, and leverage is control. With real-time access, a foreign power can anticipate every fiscal decision Burkina Faso might make when it will export, how much revenue it will gain, what reserves it will hold, when its currency will strengthen or weaken, how vulnerable it is to external pressure. In other words, data is the blueprint of sovereignty. Control the data, and you shape the future. Lose control of the data, and the future is shaped for you. That is why Traoré refused, not out of ideology, not out of pride, but because he understood the deeper reality. If they can see your gold, they can calculate your moves. If they can calculate your moves, they can corner your decisions. And once your decisions are cornered, your independence is only symbolic. But there is one more layer, the part that diplomats avoid mentioning publicly. What if the Americans weren't just trying to secure gold? What if their goal was to prevent a regional gold bloc from emerging a coordinated Sahelian system capable of influencing global pricing, controlling supply routes, and negotiating from strength rather than scarcity? A unified gold front between Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, and Guinea would disrupt more than markets. It would disrupt power. For decades, Africa's minerals flowed outward through fragmented channels. Fragmentation kept the continent predictable. Predictability kept it manageable. But unity, even informal unity, threatens the architecture that global powers rely on. A regional gold strategy supported by sovereign data grids would give the Sahel something few African regions have ever possessed: negotiating power. Real power. The kind that cannot be sanctioned easily or pressured quietly. That possibility, not the ounces, not the mines, not the exports, is what triggered concern in foreign capitals. In the end, this confrontation was not about transparency, not about governance, not even about gold. It was about who defines the rules when Africa stops playing by someone else's. And for the first time in a long time, the answer did not come from Washington, Paris, or London. It came from Ouagadougou.